Welcome back, folks. This is Module 8, Basic Mixing and Signal Flow. So this chapter sort of goes along with the concepts that we learned in 101 towards the end, dealing with different types of mixing capabilities that the software has. This goes obviously into a bit more depth than we've talked about before, talking more specifically about using not only plug-in inserts, but also hardware inserts, and specifically talking about master faders and then submasters. We'll actually build off of what we talk about here in Module 8 in Module 10. So the first part of the chapter talks about the different track types and being able to recognize a track type by its icon. So if you're looking on page 208, and you are working in the software, maybe alongside me here, you go to your mix window, you have your tracks here. I'll zoom in a bit so that we can all see. You'll notice that at the bottom here we have our 5 main track types by icon. The audio track has a waveform display here. The aux input track has a down arrow. The MIDI track has a MIDI pin connector, and the instrument track has a little keyboard icon, and finally the master fader has the Greek letter sigma. Your book also mentions video tracks, but remember, you will not have a video track active here unless you have a video clip inside your software, which is why we don't see one now. But just be aware that it also has a particular track type. And next we'll talk about mute and solo status indicators, which is talked about on 208, 209. If you were to solo a track, or any number of tracks for that matter, when you go into the edit window, you'll see up in your main toolbar here a solo status button. This is a button that will, when clicked, toggle all of the soloed tracks off after you click it. It turns yellow to indicate to you that something in your session is soloed, but again, when you click on it, no matter what is soloed, as you can see now in the edit window, all of my solos have been cleared. In addition, there's also a mute status indicator, which, just like the solo status indicator, if it is on, it is an orange color, and it indicates that something in your session has been muted. Now, the difference here is that when you click this icon, nothing happens. And it does not clear the mute status like the solo status button does. And this has to do with the fact that the mute function in Pro Tools is an automatable parameter. It's something that you can have tracks automate. So by turning this, if you were to click this icon, you would interfere perhaps with some types of tracks automation parameters. So solo, on the other hand, you cannot automate, so it is able to be cleared by clicking that status indicator. On page 209, we now talk about inserts. Inserts, as we know, are basically external pieces of gear that we plug into particular audio channels. Inserts can be put onto audio tracks, aux input tracks, and also master fader tracks. And the difference here between a master fader track and an aux input and audio track is that when you put an insert onto an audio or aux input track by using the inserts selectors, any type of plugin that you utilize up here is inserted pre-fader. Now we remember that pre-fader means that the effect is applied prior to the signal arriving to the volume fader. Now the reverse here is that when you insert a plugin on a master fader track, it is always post-fader. And this makes sense if you think about it. A master fader track is an ultimate output track in Pro Tools. So when you're applying an EQ, for example, to a master fader track, you're doing some type of mastering work. Typically, you're going to want to have 100% of that plugin applied to your signal. And as a result, the amount of effect or the amount of the insert is directly tied to the fader. So as you bring down the volume fader, it obviously also decreases the amount of the plug-in. Whereas over here on an aux input or a audio track, that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes we may want more or less of a plug-in added into our signal. So that's why they're pre-fader. And it discusses that on 210 and 209. There are two types of inserts that we work with: plug-in inserts and hardware inserts. When you click the insert selector on any audio or aux input track, you notice that there are two categories here. There is plug-in and there's I/O. The plugin menu is referring to all of the onboard effects or software plugins that come bundled with your software or that you've purchased and added to Pro Tools. These are obviously software-based, so they're digital. And you're basically, on page 2 of 10, you're routing signal the way that that diagram indicates. The track playlist is then flowing into the plugin module. It's then processed by the plugin, and then it is sent back out of the plugin on down the channel strip and eventually reaches the fader. The opposite of this, instead of using a software plugin insert, you can utilize the I/O option, which is a hardware insert. What this is referring to is a physical piece of gear that is external to the Pro Tools software. So if you have an external reverb unit, for example, you can utilize the I/O option, for example, to send a signal out of a track's output into a piece of gear and then route it back into the software via one of your audio interface's inserts. And that is drawn in a diagram fashion on page 210. So just so you're aware, you are able to utilize external gear. It's not just plugins. And in fact, most studios have a mixture of both, plugins and hardware I/O. So if you ever wanted to connect a piece of hardware to your Pro Tools rig to use for effects, and you wanted to utilize an insert on a track, you would utilize the I/O section in routing the signal. Okay, so we're going to move on now in our next video clip on sends and returns.